Hey guys, this is Mr. Howard. This lecture will be the first lecture for Chapter 3, Section 1, dealing with industries. Now, industries is very important to geography because this is referring to God's resources and mankind's utilization and maintenance of those resources that are God given. So, Section 1 is going to be dealing with primary industries. Now, Section 1 is very long. So, with that being said, I broke section one up into two parts. That way, you'll be able to interact with the content and not get too overloaded with all the information that's in section one. All right. So, let's go ahead and excuse me, get started with section one, dealing with primary industries. Primary industries. Now, when we're talking about primary industries, we have to look at um, first things first. Now, primary industries are essential to um, the earth itself because this is where we're taking God given resources and we're converting them into resources that we can use in multiple formats. But before all of that took place, we have to look at the historical backdrop of where this all started. Now, God made Adam in his own image, and he expected Adam to serve and honor him as his creator. All right. Now, Adam, as you guys already know, is not only considered the first zoologist, the first person to really interact with animals and also give them names and understand how they behave, but he also was the first botanist, okay, which is connected to the study of plants, understanding how to be an effective gardener, how to take care of them, how to grow them. All right. And so before all of this took place, this is where the concept of creation, fall, and redemption comes into the fold. And Adam did sin, all right. And as a result, there was a curse that was placed on the earth. All right. So before the curse, everything was going well. Adam was tilling the land perfectly. He was honoring God in all things that he was doing at that point. All right. And then he was also effectively managing the animals in the area. So we see him as an effective farmer in a sense, as well as him exhibiting a great deal of knowledge when it came to animal husbandry. Two components that we're going to visit in a little bit. All right. Also, mankind must now overcome many of the obstacles that became byproducts of the fall. And even though these obstacles were very tough to deal with for Adam and Eve, this didn't mean that God's blessings on Adam and Eve as well as the earth was going to be withdrawn, okay, which is a blessing within itself. So, ironically, this curse proved to be a source of blessing. Mankind was now forced to see his own limitations, okay? And as a result of those limitations, he began to also recognize his dependence and need for God himself in all things that he was doing, all right? Which then shifts to 2020, which still deals with us to this very day. Throughout scripture, God has promised to bless those who work hard and also depend on him in all things that they do. All right, so this is where we see the foundation of um, really creation, fall, redemption taking place, and most importantly, how that ties into industries dealing with mankind's utilization of God's resources. Now, let's shift gears into primary industries. Now, primary industries is just one industry within industries within itself. All right, what that means is that there are three types of industries. There are primary industries, secondary industries, and tertiary industries. All right, we're going to get into secondary industries in section two and tertiary industries in section three. So make sure you underline and highlight that primary industries are the most basic industries. Make sure you write that down in your notes. You're going to see that on your quiz. Now, when we're talking about primary industries, this is where they're taking um, earth materials or raw materials and they're converting those materials into everyday items such as food, clothing, shelter in terms of homes, building infrastructures for businesses, things of that sort. So, when we're talking about primary industries, there are four components that we have to take under consideration. All right. I created an acronym called FAM to kind of help you guys understand the organization of it. The first F represents fishing. Now, fishing is definitely important. One of the primary means of poultry or meat that was utilized in biblical times. All right. Forestry is also very important. Not only does forestry contribute to our everyday lives in terms of the plants, but the wood that is generated from forests help us with building infrastructures. It provides us with paper to utilize. There are a plethora of usages when we're talking about wood and its connection to forestry and the forestry industry. All right, so make sure you bear that in mind. The A represents agriculture. Obviously, agriculture is essential to human life as it provides us with a steady supply of food for us to consume for our everyday needs to remain healthy and survive. And as a result, because there is such a strong need for agriculture, all right, this is the reason why this industry within itself provides the most employment opportunities because everybody has to eat, regardless if you're rich, middle class, poor, everybody has to eat. All right, so this is the reason why that of all right, the four primary industries, agriculture is the largest and provides the most opportunities for employment. Lastly, mining. Mining is also essential. This is where the formation of metals are are conducted, and this is where we see, for example, steel, which is essential to building infrastructures. We're going to unpack that a little bit later. When we're talking about gold, when we're talking about platinum, palladium, silver, nickel, iron. All of these metals are connected to mining, all right, and they're very important to everyday items that we utilize, as well as building infrastructures in particular, because it provides more stability over time. Now, let's go ahead and unpack agriculture. Now, agriculture one part of God's creation mandate to Adam, to whereas God was commanding Adam to be an effective steward over his blessings, or caretaker of the environment that God created. And as a result, this is where we see God's intention for us as humans here on earth to make the earth more productive and also to maintain its beauty. All right. To try to create various initiatives to prevent air pollution, for example, to prevent the prominence and widespread um, nature of environmental waste, making sure that we're controlling the trash, um, and keeping areas sanitary. All of these things are essential to the preservation of the earth. All right, this is why we see recycling efforts taking place as well. All right, so bear that in mind when we're talking about God's creation and intention as it relates to this particular point. This also requires man to be careful about how he treats the earth, all right, to be very meticulous about how we maintain the blessing that God has blessed, has granted to us. Now, one thing that God commanded Adam to be and taught him to be, I should say, is a gardener. Make sure you highlight that. Make sure you write that in your notes, all right? That God taught Adam how to be a gardener, how to take care of the plants. And it's very important because if God is teaching Adam how to take care of plants, which is a symbol of life, all right, which also helps us live. All right. This also has given Adam a glimpse as to how to effectively be a good steward over actual human lives, such as his wife, such as his children. All right. This is why when we look at John 15, where it says that Jesus Christ is the true vine and we are the branches. A branch can't be anything without having the vine first. All right. So what that means is that there are so many principles that are taught to us through the story of Adam as a gardener in terms of God's importance on life and how agriculture and crops that are developed from agriculture not only provide life to our physical bodies, but can also be used as an example as to how to effectively be a good steward over God's blessings in human life. All right. So just something to bear in mind. As a result, Adam had two sons. All right. He had two sons at first. He had Cain and Abel, and then Seth a little bit later. All right. Now, Cain, both of these sons had responsibilities. All right. Cain was responsible for farming, he tilled the ground. All right. In comparison to Cain, you had Abel, who was responsible for animal husbandry. His responsibility was to make sure that the sheep were taken care of. And those were their respective responsibilities. Now, let's go ahead and transition into farming. Now, the first main branch of agriculture is farming. You cannot have agriculture without farming, they both go hand in hand. Now, over time, we have seen that farming has provided a steady supply of man's food. We see this all over the world. Okay. Now, in the past, most farmers produce only enough food to meet the needs of their own household. And this is true. And this contributed to the creation of various items such as clothes, furniture, as well as how their homes were built and what materials were most useful in order to build a home that can stand the test of time, as well as the climate that they were residing in. All right. Such farmers were called subsistence farmers. Okay. And make sure you place a Q next to that. Make sure you write down in your notes that farming is the first main branch of agriculture. Make sure you also write in your notes that these farmers were also called subsistence farmers who took raw materials and created home based items for their families. Now, they also created cash crops, all right, which was connected primarily to rice and corn, and eventually, cotton came into the fold as well when we're talking about clothing. All right, so make sure you highlight that point. Make sure you write that down in your notes as something to remember for your quiz. Now, the concept of farming and farmers really took a huge leap forward in the 18th century. And the reason why is because during the 18th century, this is where we begin to see what is called the agricultural revolution take place. This primarily was located in Europe as well as the United States. And this is the first time in human history where we begin to see farmers applying elements of science and machinery in order to create an increase of their crop yields so that they can then in return receive major profits. All right. And as a result, commercial farming also freed people to pursue other types of work, which is very interesting. Because when we're thinking about this, this is where we begin to see manufacturing and the technology that is connected to it begin to become more advanced. This is where we begin to see teaching opportunities unfold as well. All right. As a result of the teaching opportunities, this is where we also begin to see that colleges were developing in the area. For example, Texas A&M. Texas A&M represents Texas Agricultural and Mechanical University. All right, we started seeing these the influx of colleges that focus on agricultural and mechanical initiatives to equip students in order to become effective farmers when they graduated. All right, so this is where we also seen teaching opportunities increase. In addition to that, painting became prominent, sculpting became prominent as well. These elements were very essential to building infrastructures in terms of its beautification. All right, once buildings were finally finished, once those projects were done, you then had to make sure that they were painted so that the aesthetic nature of it was appealing to residents as well as visitors from other areas and other countries. All right. Also, sculpting, how to effectively create beautiful edifices that were also appealing to the masses as well. All right. So these are elements that are all connected to commercial farming. Okay. Now, also dealing with farming, modern industrial cities depend on the steady supply of food from commercial farms. Make sure you write that down. Make sure you notate that. Very important to remember. All farms, whether subsistence or commercial, face the same challenges. They only differ in scale. Okay. Now let me unpack what all this means. Now, one thing that's very important to remember is that farming obviously took place outside. So there wasn't too much shelter, okay, when you're talking about farming. It was all outside of a building infrastructure. That means that it was more susceptible to droughts in the climate, disease in the plants, or even sometimes the animals that were raised. All right, insect plagues, all right, windstorms. Okay, these are all elements that are critical to presenting the challenges to the farming areas over time. And this forced farmers to become more creative in terms of finding out ways to combat these challenges. Also, hailstones, flooding in the area, depending upon where you resided. How steep were your slopes in terms of hills, things of that sort. All right. Now, in order to combat these issues, irrigation reduced the threat of drought. So this is where we started seeing the creation of, for example, sprinklers. Okay. Even though they're kind of common and normal today, this was a major invention back then. All right. The concept of utilizing water and finding ways to create a hose. And then from that hose, create a sprinkling mechanism. That way, water can be supplied to a large area and a larger distance in a shorter time frame. Okay, insecticides in order to limit the threat of insects and insect plagues on the crops. All right, and also breeding improve the crop yields and resistance to disease as well. Make sure you notate all three elements as adequate and effective responses to the challenges that we talked about earlier. These are very important to the growing prominence of farming and these practices over time. Okay. Now, one issue remained though. All right. The loss of soil. Make sure you write that down in your notes. Make sure you place a Q next to that. You will see that on your quiz. In spite of all of the creations and inventions that were initiated in order to combat these challenges, the loss of soil and the nutrients within the soil became and remained a progressive problem. So as a result, wind and water can wash away soil and its nutrients, and certain crops can be depleted of the soil's nutrients. So they had to figure out ways to prevent this from happening because these elements are so natural to the earth. All right, so this is where the creation of fertilizer became very, very important. Okay, in order to make sure that even though wind and water may come, at least the fertilizer can strengthen those plants, those crops, provide those crops with the necessary nutrients that could have been washed away or depleted from the wind and water. And most importantly, it will still be able to produce a quality crop for their customers for large profits. All right, so bear that in mind when we're talking about farming. Now, the second main form of agriculture is animal husbandry. All right, now this can be subdivided into subsistence and commercial types, just like farming. Okay, so make sure you highlight that as well. That animal husbandry is the second main form of agriculture. You will see that on your quiz. Now, subsistence herding is known as nomadic herding. Make sure you write that down. There will be a question asking you what is subsistence farming also, or subsistence herding, I'm sorry, also known as. It's also known as nomadic herding. Now, this is common throughout rugged mountain areas and dry areas as well, where routine and regular farming is usually problematic. All right, so make sure you highlight that. Now, these large herds of animals, now, one thing that is very common is that they presented a heavy demand on the land for vegetation in order to grow and develop, right? So, for example, cows always had to eat a lot of grass, a lot of hay, horses. All of these animals couldn't just grow them without providing them with a steady supply of food themselves. And they stayed there rent free. All right. So as a result, this presented an initial cost to the farmers, but it all proved to be a return on investment when it came time for these horses to be utilized for other things such as war, They would sell off their horses to various militaries so that they can then be supplied with horses to utilize for warfare. Horses were also utilized for transportation purposes as well to horse and carriage companies who were in demand for horses, even though they made the carriages. All right. So this is an element that is really becoming a progressive mainstay in the economy at this time. All right. Now, also, many nomads built their homes out of animal skins because leather was lighter than wood and more readily available in grasslands. All right. Another point to notate, make sure you highlight that. You will need to know that for your quiz and test. Now, make sure you also write down that in the 18th century, during this time period, this is where we begin to see during the agricultural revolution that we indicated earlier. All right, Europeans developed a second method of animal husbandry called ranching. Now, this element made its way into the United States, and this is why we see a lot of ranches in certain areas like West Virginia, Pennsylvania, even Texas down south. Certain portions of Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, North Carolina. We see these ranches develop in areas that had an abundance of open land for residents to farm. All right, and also raise livestock and cattle. All right, so ranching became essential during this time period. In early America, colonial America, ranchers let their cattle run free on the open range so that they can create somewhat of a habitat, if you will, that allow animals to kind of operate in their um, in an area where they weren't as encapsulated and confined. Rather, they can develop and grow. Horses can gallop in open areas as they would gallop in an area that had absolutely um, no forms of confinement or no gates. All right. Another thing is that government land to which no one had claim. All right, which means that there were certain lands that were privately owned by farmers and ranchers, and as a result, they were not under the jurisdiction of the government, so that they can operate them as long as they were paying their taxes on the property. All right, so this is the one of the reasons why animal husbandry became so prominent is because of ranching. All right, during the 18th century, during the agricultural revolution, which started in Europe and made its way into the United States. Now, lastly, for part one, and then we're going to park here. Now, as a result, when we're talking about animal husbandry, okay, we have to also consider that there were a lot of countries throughout the world that began to produce a steady supply of beef for not only their citizens within their respective countries, but they also began to outsource it and send it to other countries for trade. So the United States at this point is still one of the top producers of beef in the world. I'm at 21% of the world's supply of beef. The European Union is a close second at 15. Then you have Brazil, China, and India. Now, these are the top five. Make sure you know all five. There will be one or two that's going to be on the quiz, so make sure you're familiar with all five countries, the order in which they rank, as well as their respective percentages for your quiz. Now, that concludes part one of section one. All right. Look forward to seeing you guys in part two of section one. Take care. God bless.